Hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is Naziaty Mohd Yaacob, your host for Talk Architecture podcast, continuing the topic on when and why did architecture isolate itself as a profession. Eisenman versus Alexander debate in 1982, part 2. We are now more acquainted with this debate than ever before, and I would like to put it in the context of adaptive reuse. It is brought to my attention that the old building stock, which any building in the world now will become an old building stock soon, 10 years, 20 years time, 30 years time. So we can look at examples before how certain building configuration or the design of the building can be adapted for future use. So in the context of sustainable development goals, what are the principles in designing architecture that would assist with us SDGs? And in the context of climate change, zero waste, low carbon, renewable energy, and so on. Yeah. Now, the debate here starts with building form. Now, if Eisenman and the deconstructivists since 1981, in the postmodern era of architecture development, insist that because of disharmony is needed to actually make you think about harmony. So the proponents of deconstruction, constructivists or deconstructivists would argue for disharmony because architecture is a language. Architecture converse with the, the urban scape, and that architecture could, if it's disharmonious, it could create interesting experiences and add to the value of the urban landscape or urban design. But at the same time, when we see that these architecture, which normally are designed in a way they are not in a linear or rectilinear form, but in the curvilinear or in amorphous forms. Okay, they're specialized building, but some of them are offices, and some of them could be speculative offices, a type of building, or factory, or museums, or institutions, and so on. Now, the most speculative ones, such as offices, would be too specific in its form that it's difficult to adapt and reuse for a different type. Just say you want to convert the speculative office, which is of a curvilinear or an um, uh, amorphous form, into a residential habitable building. So it can't really, and it will cost a lot of money to do so. So that means that in terms of SDGs, the type of building that uses that sort of language that Eisenman is arguing for is not going to be viable to be converted into a different type, such as a residential building. May it be an elderly housing or housing for people and such. And now we look at the types of buildings out there in terms of a residential building. Can it be converted into a more accessible and universal design building for elderly persons, for example? So we also look at perhaps in terms of the details, you can change them, that it's viable to change them with additional costs. But in terms of the layout, the basic block or the cluster, so never mind the unit design, but the basic block. If it is an existing residential building, it can be converted into an accessible one if, in a minimum cost factored in. So that we know, residential buildings. But what about office buildings and other institutional buildings? In Malaysia, we have examples of office buildings that converted into hotels, for example. The one that I see in front of me, like the Pullman Hotel. And that took quite some time before that was done. And there's also legal repercussions as well with regard to these different building types. Industrial or factory buildings have difficulty to be converted into residential, apparently, in this country. But that's about the law, and the laws can change. However, when we reflect again on the Eisenman versus Alexander debate, Alexander merely looked at it objectively when he was arguing for harmony. It was more of a generatively produced design, and the most convenient one would be a linear or rectilinear configuration, obviously, in which it's not only in plan but also in spatial terms of the heights in sections and elevations need to have, in a way, properties that could easily add and subtract from it. So the cost factor would be minimized in terms of regenerating or readapting into a different type. So, yes, Alexander mentioned about the delight that the spaces need to offer to the human being, more humane, or spaces that are scaled to be closer to the sensorial experience of touch, feel, taste, smell, hear, and vision, and also spatial sense. I mean, some of the examples in his book, The Nature of Order, gives examples of the delight that one needs to have with the building, as opposed to the disharmonious buildings that Eisenman proposes, such as forms that are sort of molded and created in a way that the scale is distorted as well against the order of things. The agenda is to provoke or create a sense of awe in terms of a different kind of space rather than the more familiar ones. But of course, we can also argue that in generative design, you can also have interesting scales and differentiations to create volumes and spatial configurations that could also provoke awe and have a sense of the wonder about it. So you can't really say one or another is much better in terms of providing that factor. So going back to this topic of when and why did architecture isolate itself as a profession? It's when it was during this postmodern era with And now, when is the timeline of things happening? Now, if it suits the agenda, then you go for disharmony or architecture that is kind of like not easily adaptable. So you kind of waste money, or you kind of, you can't really use that architecture for different type. So in this day and age, can we afford that? Not to be able to have architecture that are able to adapt itself for future use. So this is a continuation on what we have started to discuss, that perhaps we don't have any choice but to go back to a much more objectified and generative design to foresee the future adaptability of the built environment, and to look at architecture not just iconically a standalone building, but part of a urban design. And that's what Alexander wanted as well, to bring in the bridge between architecture and planning. So, what is interesting is that in this debate, that was in 1982, everything was fresh. People architecture profession decided that, okay, let's play with all these forms using parametric design generated by computer-aided software and digital application, Rhino and everything else, to come up with all this interesting rendering and illustration that we can actually build this stuff. And it's proven out there that this is being built, but how long will it last? When people look at some building types like stadiums and do not see that, like there's a case of a stadium in Malaysia, in the state of Selangor, which works as a stadium very well, but when one look at it as a structure, one can't really reuse a stadium, because it's that form where it's curvilinear and specific to type, which means that it's for spectating and playing a performance, or viewing a sports event and so on, right? So there is the viability of keeping the structure is less in terms of how you want to develop it. So it will be destroyed. So how much does that cost, and how much of a material waste is that? Excuse me. So one can look at what had transpired before and what is beginning to happen in the built environment, in closest to home, closest to where you are. And what happened to those structures that are more iconic, what happened to them after serving for about 20 years. It's quite often it's in 20 years' time, then it's obsolete. But there are a lot of structures that being reused over and over again, like typical shop houses. Some are very flimsy or small, so some people will just get rid of it, because, like the traditional Malay house, for example, you just destroy everything and just build on top of it. But how do we view this properly? How do we actually look at sustainable development goals properly, in terms of looking at it in terms of architecture viewpoint? And of course, you have to cost it in and everything, but how do you seriously look at it policy-wise? And society would 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 be dictated by dollars and cents in a way that the developers could influence what is happening to the built environment. But when will there be a critical mass where they would need to make decisions? Where would law and policies come where they stop developers from speculating too much? Those are other debates, obviously, and people would tell me that it's no use debating about these things or architecture education. It's what the market demands. It's what architecture is all about. We have to follow the status quo or the normal practice. What are you going on and on about? Now we go back to that point where architecture isolates itself. How does a profession be relatable or be relevant to the whole industry, to the whole idea of the guardians or the ones that know the wisdom of how the built environment need to be developed and need to be kept. Like the guardian, meaning the guardian of the galaxies. Now, what I'm trying to say is that the guardian in terms of people who are wise and know that what is good for the built environment, a sense of everything, a sense of place, a sense of welcome, a sense of how the voids work between the buildings and other principles like safety, usability, accessibility, um, defensible spaces, and delightful spaces, and so on. How can we actually get to be conscious of this? That's when generative design by Alexander comes into place. There's all those things that had been written about the built environment that needs to be mindful of what I've said just now, all those principles that make a much more humane or architecture for the community is based on generative design principles. Now, another debate about this is UI UX designers, or those who design using the digital method or digital way of producing. They use universal design principles much more than architects. So it's all about function is to be considered much more important over form. When we talk about the old debate of form follows function or function follows form, which is much more important, form will be generated from functional requirements. And it won't make the architecture less beautiful. Because what is beauty is that the use, the utility. Yes, we have the three venustas, utilitas, and firmitas. Obviously, it has to be strong enough to last. Or some architecture doesn't have to be last forever. It can be built for 30 years, depending on the purpose, the fit for purpose. Then it comes to utilitas and venustas. What is beauty but the delight in using it? After a while, the gloss or the form fades away. And are we building architecture just as a whim to satisfy ourselves? So what is the responsibility of developers, of those who have money to build the one-offs, and what is an urban public space? What is the sense of the urbanity of a sense of place, or what makes us feel happier? All goes back to generative design, all goes back to objectifying architecture and just producing or serving meaningful spaces by using those principles of generating architecture in a way that is more humane and sensorial. There's another factor that needs to be factored in, the sensorial experience, apart from universal design. And this all relate to the functionality of the design. Okay, you may not agree with me. You may think that, okay, that's my opinion. It may not be the same as others. But have we actually debate this in architecture education and architecture practice, or what we're producing out there? Have we actually asked those questions that needed to be asked? So that's the reason for this topic today. We need to start asking those questions. And society can determine that they want to say to what's happening to the built environment.